So you think you know the law, right? Well, what if I told you there's a hidden logic underneath it all? A kind of secret operating system that explains why our legal rules are the way they are. Today, we're diving into law and economics, a really powerful way of seeing the familiar world of law through a brand new, scientific, and honestly, sometimes pretty surprising economic lens. Let's jump in.
First up, we'll get a handle on what this whole movement is trying to achieve. Then, we'll break down the two core principles that are the engine for all its analysis. After that, we'll see how these ideas apply to things like property and contracts, and finally, we'll look at how they explain accidents and even crime.
All right, so what is the big idea here? Well, at its core, law and economics has this incredibly ambitious goal: to take the study of law out of the world of just, subjective arguments and put it on a solid, objective, scientific footing.
And this idea is just perfectly summed up by Judge Richard Posner, who was a huge figure in this movement. He basically asks, look, the law is this massive social system that affects everything, so why shouldn't we study it scientifically, just like we study biology or physics? And for Posner, economics gives us the perfect toolkit to do just that.
This whole way of thinking really took off back in the 1960s. It kind of started with this landmark paper by Ronald Coase. Then, another guy, Gary Becker, took these economic tools and applied them to totally new areas, like the study of crime. And by the way, both of those guys won Nobel Prizes for their work. And then Richard Posner came along in the early 70s and really cemented it all into a formal discipline. These three are basically the founding fathers.
Okay, so how does this new lens actually work? Like any science, it's got to have some ground rules, some core principles. And for law and economics, it all pretty much boils down to two fundamental assumptions that guide every single analysis.
The first, and honestly the most important principle, is efficiency. This is the absolute center of everything. Now, in this world, efficient has a super specific meaning. A legal rule is considered efficient if it gives a right, like the right to clean air, to whoever values it the most. And how do we measure that value? By who'd be willing to pay the most to have it.
Now, inside this idea of efficiency, there are really two main schools of thought. You've got the positive theory, which is Posner's thing. It looks at the law we already have and basically argues that it has naturally evolved over time to become efficient. Then you have the normative theory, which is more about making a prescription. It argues that we should actively design our laws to be as efficient as possible. So it's the difference between what is and what ought to be.
The second big rule is a classic you've probably heard from economics. People are rational, and they respond to incentives. Now, this doesn't mean we're all perfect, emotionless robots. Not at all. It just means that if you change the costs or the benefits of doing something, people's behavior will change in a predictable way. You make the speeding ticket more expensive? Guess what? Fewer people are going to speed. It's really that simple. So, we've got our two rules: efficiency and incentives. Now for the fun part. Let's see how they actually apply in the real world, starting with two of the most basic building blocks of any legal system: property and promises, or contracts. For a system of property rights to be truly efficient, these scholars argue it needs three key features. First, universality. Pretty much everything of value is owned by someone. Second, exclusivity. It's crystal clear who that single owner is. And third, transferability. The owner has to be free to sell or trade that right to somebody else.
And that framework immediately makes you wonder, right? What are the consequences when those conditions aren't met? Specifically, what happens when something isn't owned by anyone at all?
And this leads us directly to one of the most famous concepts in all of economics: the tragedy of the commons. It's a perfect illustration. Think about fish in the ocean. Because no one owns the fish, no single fisherman has a reason to leave any behind for tomorrow. The only way to make a fish yours is to catch it. So the rational thing for every individual to do leads to a total collective disaster. The fish stocks get depleted. And that's a direct result of inefficient property rights. The same kind of logic applies to contracts, and it leads to this really fascinating, kind of mind-bending idea: the efficient breach. Let's walk through it. Say I sign a contract to build something for you for 60 grand. But then, whoops, my costs suddenly go through the roof, up to 160 grand. If you force me to finish the job, you're literally creating a $100,000 loss for society. Law and economics says the most efficient thing to do here is for me to break the contract, pay you whatever damages you're owed, and we all avoid that massive, wasteful loss. It's a crazy idea, right? That sometimes breaking a promise is actually better for everyone.
Okay, so property law defines our rights, and contract law lets us trade them. But what about protecting those rights from being harmed? Well, that's where tort law and criminal law come in. And as you can probably guess, they also get a really fascinating breakdown through this economic lens.
In tort law, which is all about accidents, you basically have two main standards for who pays.
Under a negligence rule, you're only forced to pay if you were careless, meaning you didn't take precautions that were worth taking. But under strict liability, it doesn't matter how careful you were. If your actions cause an injury, you pay, period. We usually save that one for super dangerous stuff, like blasting with dynamite, because the goal is to create a huge incentive to maybe not do that activity at all. Each rule creates a very different incentive for safety.
Now criminal law. This is where the economic logic gets really cool. Think about it. We can't afford to catch every single criminal. It would cost a fortune. So the goal is efficient enforcement. So, if we know that we're probably only going to catch, say, 1 out of every 4 criminals who commit a certain crime, how do you still deter people? The economic answer is you multiply the punishment. The one person you do catch has to face a penalty that's 4 times as severe to make up for the 3 that got away.
This way of thinking leads to another key insight. Whenever it's possible, fines are economically way better than prison. And why is that? Well, a fine is just a transfer of money from the criminal to the state. No real value is lost to society as a whole. But prison, that creates what economists call a deadweight loss. Society loses anything that person could have produced, plus we have to spend a ton of money to lock them up. So, from a purely economic view, the preference is always for fines. Prison is the backup, used only when a criminal can't or won't pay a fine that's big enough to create that deterrent effect.
Okay, this all sounds really logical on a whiteboard. It's clean, it's calculated, but it all comes down to the most important question, doesn't it? Does this cold economic approach to crime and punishment actually work in the messy real world? Does it actually reduce crime?
Well, this is where the rubber meets the road. And the source material points to a massive amount of empirical research on this. Over and over, studies seem to show that, yes, increasing the probability and the severity of punishment does tend to reduce crime. Now, some of the findings get pretty controversial. For example, the source cites some recent studies that find a significant deterrent effect for capital punishment. Other famous research it points to has argued that easing abortion restrictions led to a drop in crime decades later, and studies on laws allowing concealed weapons have showed mixed results, though some prominent ones do find a decrease in crime.
And all of this leaves us with one last, really big, challenging question. The entire field of law and economics is built on this idea that our legal rules can be, and maybe should be, optimized for efficiency. But that forces us to bump up against a much deeper, more philosophical problem. If we can calculate the most efficient outcome, what then is the economic value of a concept like justice? It's a question that lives right at that fascinating and maybe uncomfortable intersection of a spreadsheet and the human soul, and it's what makes this field so endlessly interesting to think about.